Welcome to Commander Central, episode 202, and today we'll be taking a look at listener Tyler Coates' Wait, This Isn't Reki, Rona's Disciple of Gix deck. I'm Dana.
And I'm Max.
Max, how's it going?
Going good for a Monday afternoon.
That's kind of what I'm thinking. It's a little bit overcast here, not as sunny as it was when we last recorded, but as far as Mondays go, and I guess it's a Thursday if you're listening, we're doing all right.
Yeah.
Got to play some games this weekend.
We did get about 3 games in together on Saturday night.
I got to win a game with my new Timuret deck with an Arc Bond.
That was a very interesting game.
So Arc Bond, when a creature is dealt combat damage, it deals damage to each creature and player equal to the amount of damage it's dealt, not what it deals. And right before I'm doing my attack, I'm like, how big is your strongest creature there, Max? I'm like trying to figure out who is going to block with the right number. And Max had a creature that was 7 power, so I swung into it, and it was a creature with Infect, so, you didn't want to let that come through, so you blocked with your 7 power creature. And I cast Arc Bond, which dealt 7 damage to everyone, including me. But since the creature had Infect, that was 7 poison counters, and I was at 0, and everyone else was at 4 or 5, so... That was a pretty good win. I felt happy about that one. And I think you won. Did you win 2 games?
I did win 2 games, I believe.
The last one was with Brago, correct?
Yes, I won with Brago through a Approach of the Second Sun. First time ever doing it.
That's right, yep.
And you know what? I'm glad I put it in the deck because it definitely helped make sure that game didn't go for 2 hours.
That game was dragging at that point, so that was the right time to cast it. And the first one was a Dramoka game, I believe.
Yeah, Dramoka just, got my life total up above everybody. I sat in the 60s for quite a long time, and, by the end of the game, nobody could make the move to knock me off the pedestal.
You got the beats through. That's what matters.
Yep.
So that feels good. We got to play a few games, and we have a couple scheduled with a few listeners for this Saturday, hopefully. So hopefully we'll have some of those to report back on next week.
Awesome.
If you out there in listener land would like to reach out to us and talk about some cool games you played or just say hi, how would you do that, Max?
Head over to Twitter and find us at CMDR Central. You can Facebook search us CMDR Central. You can comment on all of our YouTube videos by searching CMDR Central. And you can also find us over at patreon.com/CMDR Central, where you can check out our reward tiers and get a Decks You Play episode just for yourself if you're so inclined.
And I think we have a couple of new Patreon supporters to mention here.
We do. So we want to say hello and thank you to Bill, Bo Madsen, Carlos Carrion, Heart of Tanks, and Dylan Boom. And those last 2, we also want to say welcome back because they had been supporting us. Had to leave for a little bit, but now they're back.
So thank you to everyone for your support, even if your support is just listening and upvoting on various podcast listening platforms. We appreciate anything anyone can do. So thanks a lot to our listeners. It means a great deal to us. We did get some announcements this morning. Again, this is Monday, so this will be Thursday when it goes out, about some bannings that was almost entirely companion-based. There was one minor thing, though, for Commander. Nothing got banned, but there was a line in the Commander rules text that stated that it used the same ban list as Vintage. Just because at that point in time, there were no cards banned from Vintage. And as of today, that is no longer true. One of the partners was outright, flat out banned in that format, and it's not banned in Commander. So they just removed that line from the Commander rules. So that won't affect anyone or anything. It's just a cleanup thing, but I guess we might as well mention that briefly. Interestingly enough, though, they did comment that they are considering changing the way companions work in the game as a whole. So I'll be curious to see what that rule change is, because that, however, should cascade, or could, I guess. I guess the rules committee could choose to ignore it, but that could very easily cascade down into Commander, at least in terms of how the companions work. It wouldn't surprise me to see as it would be something like if you have a companion, maybe start with 1 less card in your opening hand or something, who knows? But if they do make that change, it'll be interesting to see if that does affect us in Commander.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what type of rules changes will impact the game as a whole with this hint we were given today.
Yeah. And in Commander, companions have had marginal impact. We talked about it on the Dietrich cast last week, just because of the way the format works, being 99 cards, 100 cards, 99 card library, and no repeats. It's just a vastly different thing. But, it's something. So we will report back if and when something does happen there. So, shall we jump into this deck tech?
Let's do it.
All right. why don't you read back to us what Tyler told us about his deck?
So Tyler, as always, we ask our questions like we normally do. So Tyler wrote back saying, for the most part, he plays in a pretty casual meta. Budget-wise, nothing's too ridiculous as long as we don't go recommending a bunch of Underground Seas and super expensive cards. The goal of this deck is to play out all the legendaries of Dimir, if possible. The ways he wins is through Beatdown, Atrata, the Silencer triggers, Phage, the Untouchable triggers. He also has a Jace Wielder of Mysteries to, in case he does deck himself, that can, be there as a safety net. Weaknesses of the deck, for Dimir, he's playing a lot of creatures instead of normally the spells or artifacts that you might see in this deck. He would like to see if we catch any cool legendaries he might have overlooked. And no Eldrazi, they're not cool.
I am on board with all of that. I am not a huge Eldrazi fan, so I get you. So this is a pretty delightful deck. I really like seeing oddball things like this, and this is a Rona Disciple of Gix deck, and the reason it's called Wait, This Isn't Reki is because it's running 33 different legendary creatures. And I will here read off what Rona does in case anyone forgot, because of all the commanders or all the legendary creatures we got in Dominaria, she saw very little play. Rona Disciple of Gix is 1 blue-black for a legendary creature human artificer. She's a 2/2 and says, when Rona Disciple of Gix enters the battlefield, you may exile target historic card from your graveyard. And historic cards, as a reminder, are artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. You may cast non-land cards exiled with Rona, and then you can spend 4 and tap her to exile the top card of your library, which is probably not an ability worth doing anything in the deck to amplify, but it's there as an option. So, traditionally, I guess I shouldn't even say traditionally, this card's only been out a year and a half. I would have thought people would have built her as some kind of an artifact commander and not a particularly good one. But, as I said when I read that reminder text, legendaries are historic, so why not treat this kind of like a Reki deck? And essentially, Rona's going to allow you to cast any of these legendaries that you exile from your graveyard and just bring them back into play and kind of have one more way to get these beaters people remove back onto the battlefield to do some damage. So that's a very creative use of Rona. I like it a lot. This is a card that isn't super strong, but I think it has fantastic art on it, so I like the card a lot, and I'm glad to see someone found a really creative way to play it, particularly since, the obvious for its artifacts, like I said, and this is just a kind of a really wild way to build a deck. So let's jump and look at the land base first here. Max, what do we have for lands?
We're sitting at 36 lands. That includes 23 basic lands, so 12 basic snow-covered islands and 11 snow-covered swamps. You also have the duals you would typically see, minus the Underground Sea, so there's a Watery Grave, Underground River, Sunken Hollow, Drowned Catacombs, and then a few utility lands like Bajuka Bog, Dark Depths, Miko Koruru, the Center of the Sea. Sure, that draws some cards. Along with an Untadaki, the Cloudkeeper, which makes your legends cast for 2 less. Or you can pay 2 life to gain 2 mana to cast.
It's essentially an ancient tomb for legendary spells, basically.
Yep. There's also a Thespian Stage to work off that Dark Depths and a Westvale Abbey.
Okay, so first thing, and then this is a little bit more of a meta comment here, because this came up a lot recently online, people talking about land counts and decks. The precons tend to come with 38, 39-ish. I've seen a lot of people talking about, players should be running closer to 38, 39 lands and decks. So I do want to briefly address that. I'm of 2 minds. I tend to agree that, particularly if you're new to the game, if you've just started playing Commander in the last year, I would highly recommend sticking to probably 38 lands. You'll be better off, if you open the game with too many lands than you will with not enough. So I do say that is true. However, as with all things, I don't think there's necessarily a hard and fast rule about how you want to do this. And if you are someone who's been playing a long time and you know how your deck beats function and you've got a feel for those kind of things, particularly in a 1 or 2 color deck, 36 lands is plenty, I think. I very rarely have a problem with it, especially if your deck has a relatively low CMC. This one is at 3/5, so it's not super low, but I still think you can probably get away with it. Do you have any quick thoughts on that, Max?
I mean, we're in Dimir, so your ramp options aren't great.
They're not. That's very true.
There are at least 4, if not 5 mana rocks in this deck in the artifact section, and a couple cost reducers, so that helps with these higher costed legendaries we're going to go over. I don't know, I don't play Dimir, but I feel like I would probably sit in the 37 area, even with a 3.5 average CMC. I think I'd rather draw too many lands in my opening hand than not enough.
Sure. And like I said, there's a lot of variables here. Like we'll talk about, I have a Dimir deck, my Veil with the Nightclad deck, but I don't know how comparable it is because number one, that deck has, I want to say 40 artifacts in it. Might be 39, but 39 or 40 colorless artifacts. So land count doesn't necessarily make a huge difference there, but the land variance does. And I'm just fine if I happen to have a bunch of colorless sources from utility lands, or if I happen to have all islands and no swamps or whatever. I can fudge those numbers a little bit because as long as I have lands out, they almost always let me cast the spells I want to cast. I also have a lot more draw in that deck. There's no particularly cheap draw. There's no Night's Whisper in this deck. There's no Sign in Blood in this deck. So I can, if I keep a 2 or 3 lander, I have half a dozen different cheap spells that there's a good chance I'll have one of them in my hand in the first 3 turns, and they'll hopefully let me draw down to hit that 4th land or something. So there's a ton of variables about land counts. So anyway, I wanted to touch on that briefly because there is 36 lands here, and I have seen some talk about it, and I don't think that's a wrong number, but I don't know if it's a right number either. I think you have to kind of figure that out on your own and see where you are comfortable in your deck. All right, a couple things I wanted to touch on here briefly. A couple lands I do like in here. We have Gyre Reach Sanitarium, which is not a land I normally love in decks. It's taps for a colorless, spend 2, each player draws a card, then discards a card, which is relevant here, and it's why I do like it in this deck. It lets you pitch that legend away because you're not really pitching it away. It functionally, in this deck, can oftentimes wind up just being a second hand. So the downside for you in this deck isn't much of a downside, whereas it's more of a downside for other people generally. I don't know if I love it, but I think it does make sense in this deck to a degree. Do you have any thoughts on this one, Max?
I think you kind of mentioned it. There isn't a lot of draw in this deck to begin with.
Yep.
So I'm going to take any piece of it I can get, and if it comes with Gyre Reach Sanitarium, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I think it just kind of depends on how... I like seeing this card played in by my opponents, and I like it when it's in the early game because, there's more players, everybody's probably in that 5 to 7 cards in hand still, so I don't feel as bad giving, having that player give everybody an extra card. Where this might get a little more risky is when you're down to you and another opponent, and that one card you're giving them might be their board wipe to help them win, or their overwhelming stampede. So the more players that you're giving cards to means you can politic a little more and make sure nobody kills you. When it's down to you and one other, I think you're walking a fine line there.
Yeah, and at that point you just have to maybe resign yourself to I just maybe now at this point in the game can't really use my draw land.
Yeah.
And it is what it is. Any suggestions for lands here?
Tyler isn't running the typical, land destruction lands, and maybe he doesn't have to deal with that in his metas where he plays, so even Ghost Quarter, Field of Ruin, Strip Mine, those aren't in this deck. Scavenger Grounds, which would probably hurt this deck a little bit.
Yes.
There's some graveyard stuff in this deck, but I don't think it would be backbreaking if you put it in here just to make sure you can protect against more tuned graveyard strategies that you might run into.
One I might be tempted to run here myself would be Teleria West, which has Transmute, and once you basically turn it into another land for 3 mana. It does come into play tapped, but worst case scenario, it comes into play tapped, and it's still a land you can use for blue mana. But you do have a couple of absolute haymaker lands in this deck. Westvale Abbey, Dark Depths being those 2. Being able to go get those basically without having to devote a card slot to an expedition map or something, I think is really, really tempting. I'm not running it in my Dimir deck, but I don't have any lands that are super, super powerful in that deck. I'm not running Depths. I'm not running Thespian Stage. I'm not running things like that. If I was, I would probably put Teleria West in the deck just because the opportunity cost is really, really low and the upside is pretty high. Grab even Thespian Stage. If you already have Dark Depths, go get Thespian Stage with it. There's almost always going to be a really good target, and if there just happens to not be one, well then it's probably turn 12 at that point in the game if there's no good targets for you to get, and you don't care if it comes into play tapped.
Right.
So that's one I would probably find a slot for, although I think that's not a cheap card these days. I guess I didn't look to see what it was.
No, it is not.
But I want to say it's closing on $15.
Yeah.
So I get why you might not be running that. Any final land thoughts?
I do have one suggestion as well, and that would be Buried Ruin. Just a cheap way to get an artifact back from the graveyard to your hand. There are a handful of great artifacts in this deck that would be a shame if they sat in a graveyard for too long, so it'd just be a great cheap way to recur
Okay.
something that might help win the game.
And I went and looked, Max, to prevent anyone from yelling at their radio right now. Terraria West it's only about $7.
Okay, so it has come down in price.
Has come down. So that's not nothing, but it's not 15 either. All right, let's move on here and look at the creature base because there's a ton of them and it's a huge part of the deck.
Let's do it.
All right, 33 creatures, and every single one of them is a legend, which I respect sticking to theme. Atris, Oracle Half-Truths, Berade's Conjurer Adept, which lets each player put an artifact, creature, or land card from their hand into play at the beginning of each player's upkeep. Risk with Berade's is you play it, you can't take advantage of it, everyone else does, and then it gets killed before it comes back to you. So Berade's is risky, but a lot of upside there. Emery Orker the Lock, both Ereboses. We have Gieson Geralf, God Eternal Bantu, Gonti Lord of Luxury, Grimgrin Corpseborn, Gyruda Doom of Depths, one of the new companions, Jace Vrin's Prodigy, that's the flip Jace from Magic Origins, Kami the Crescent Moon, which at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, King Makar the Gold Cursed, Lazav the Multifarious, Massacre Girl, Narumiha Master Wizard from Dominaria. Narumiha has Flash, and when it enters battlefield, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control, and you may choose new targets for the copy. We have Nizal, Primal Tide, Una, Queen of the Fae, Phage the Untouchable. We'll read Phage here quick. When Phage comes into play, if you didn't play it from your hand, you lose the game. And when Phage deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature, it can't be regenerated. Whenever Phage deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. So I'm sure we'll come back and talk about Phage here in a few minutes. We have Phoenix, God of Deception, the god that mills. One thing nice about Phoenix is it can target a player, so in this deck you can use it to put cards in your graveyard that you can then exile when you cast Rona. Rankle, Master of Pranks, Sakashima the Imposter, Silas Wren, Seeker Adept, Tetsamok, Primal Death, Thada Adal, Acquisitor. There's a way to get some ramp on a creature body by stealing some soul rings.
Oh, yeah.
Thassa, Deep Dwelling. Torgar, Famine Incarnate. That's an 8-mana creature that was Dominaria as well. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice any number of creatures. It costs 2 less to cast for each creature sacrificed this way. And when Torgar, Famine Incarnate enters the battlefield, up to one target player's life total becomes half their starting life total. Traxos, Scourge of Krug. Urza, Lord High Artificer, Venzer Shaper Savant, that's the creature Venzer from Back in Future Sight, Virtus the Veiled, which is half of the Virtus Gorm combo from Battle Bond, and Virtus has Death Touch, and when he deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life rounded up. And last, Yuriko the Tiger's Shadow. Whew. All right, I read all 33. We got there. So one of the things that Tyler asked here is if we had any suggestions for creatures in particular, and I see you have a couple written down here, Max.
I do. So I'm going to start off with my biggest suggestion, which would be Sun Quan, Lord of Wu. This was a legend from the
Portal Third Age, I believe.
Yeah, Portal 3 Kingdoms. But it was also reprinted in From the Vault Legends, and that copy's only about $15, I believe. It was less than $20, so it's not that expensive to pick up. And what this creature does, it gives your entire team horsemanship. And for those that don't know, horsemanship creatures have to be blocked by creatures with horsemanship.
So it's a better flying, essentially,
yes,
for as far as we're concerned in Commander, since there's so few creatures that see play with horsemanship at all. Basically, he will render your team unblockable.
Yeah, just so, if creature beats is one of the big ways to win in this deck, helping them get through because there's not a bunch of trample givers in Dimir.
Right.
This would be a great addition to the legend lineup, while providing a very good keyword for your entire team pretty much to have.
I mean, if you have multiple creatures down that have any significant size, and there's quite a few big beaters in here just because there's a handful of gods and things like that, you drop Sun Quan, you're probably going to kill someone if they don't have a response because they can't block. So I like that as well. It's a good addition. It's a useful creature that basically functionally gives you a way to win a game too on top of it. That's a really good suggestion.
My next suggestion would be Draina, Liberator, Malakir. So this is the 3-mana Draina from Oath of the Gatewatch that has flying and first strike. And when it hits an opponent, all your other creatures get a +1/+1 counter on them. I would swap this out for Gisa and Geralf just because there are only 3 zombies total in the entire deck.
Yep.
So using Gisa and Geralf's ability of during your turns you may cast a zombie creature card from your graveyard, I don't know how often that's going to be applicable. Yeah, when they enter the battlefield, you get to mill 4 cards from your library into your graveyard, but I think just having an in-the-air beater that's going to pump your team might just be better overall.
Yeah, I agree with that, I think, as well. That's just a really good value body in general. On a similar note, actually from the same block, Kalidas, Trader of Gat, I know he's not a super cheap card because he was seeing some modern play for a while, so I think he's probably still sitting around $10.
I think he's more than that, but yes.
Is he more than that right now?
I think he's pushing
Oh
20.
man, I just double checked. You're right, he's pushing 20. Oof. All right, you know what? I might as well say my spiel here despite him costing 20. A 3-4 for 4 mana is not that extraordinary, but he does have lifelink. The thing here, though, is if another non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile that card and put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield, it just shuts down some decks. There's just some graveyard shenanigan decks that the person's not going to be able to do whatever crazy graveyard stuff they wanted to do. That's just a lot of utility on a pretty functional 3-4 package for 4 mana. And, technically you can also sacrifice a vampire or zombie to put 2 counters on Kalidas. Not a ton of zombies or vampires in this deck, but you do make zombies with that ability. So a couple creatures get exiled because they die with Kalidas out. You make a few zombies and you can sack them to make Kalidas even bigger for a alpha strike and gain some life back that you might lose. Again, I think there's just a lot of utility in Kalidas, and if you happen to have one or can get one relatively cheaply, I think he would fit the deck very nicely as well. Any more here, Max?
Yeah, I have 2 more.
Okay.
The first being the Scarab God. I think this is just a value engine in itself. You can pay 4 mana to pretty much exile a creature from any graveyard and make a 4/4 copy of it on your battlefield.
Yep.
Great way for some graveyard hate, which really it's not in this deck. It's a good body, and it goes back to your hand if it hits the graveyard. So, you can recur it quite often as long as it doesn't get exiled. And then my final suggestion, another Dominaria legend, would be Whisper Blood Witchergist.
Yep.
It's 3 and a black for a 2/2, and it has tap. Sacrifice 2 creatures, return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. Sacking 2 creatures in this list might seem a little high-costed because there's not a lot of token makers. This would be great if some of these creatures made tokens more than Una. But, sacking something that isn't really doing anything, sacking that Gonti that you've gotten the activation off of and you don't have a way to blink it, along with something else to return something that's going to be able to do something for you right away, is a great trade in my opinion.
I can be on board with that for sure. I wanted to talk about Phage here briefly. So, Phage is a old, interesting, weird card. The question is the text on Phage, when it comes into play, if you didn't play it from your hand, you lose the game. So sometimes that's not a big deal. We see it in our shop. There's a Lazav the Multifarious deck in the shop, and it's never casting Phage or bringing it into play for the most part. Lazav is copying Phage. And I'm assuming that's the use here as well, because there's Lazav in the deck, because you can't use your commander's ability on Phage. Because you can't bring it into play without losing the game if you use Rona's ability to cast it, because it's not being cast from your hand. So
right.
I'm curious, because that seems like Phage is a super cool card, and maybe in this case it's worth the fact that, maybe it's such a good story. Maybe the thought process is, even though it's only going to happen once every 200 games, because for it to work, you have to have Phage in the graveyard somehow, not exiled with Rona, and then also presumably have Lazav out and in play, able to do stuff with Phage. That just seems like a lot of things you're hoping to have happen in a deck where Lazav isn't your commander.
Yeah, the Lazav thing has to be the goal. Otherwise, just hardcasting Phage for 7 with quad black.
Which is tough.
That's a story on its own as well, in my opinion.
Right. Maybe that's true. That could be. And sometimes these kind of things, I totally agree, it's worth it for the story. So if that's what it is, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Comi the Crescent Moon, I mentioned on Braids that there's the concern that it spins around the table and you don't get to take advantage of it. The same thing is true of Comi the Crescent Moon. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. You play Comi the Crescent Moon and everyone else can possibly draw a card off it before, and then it gets blown up and you get nothing. I don't love that. Maybe that's me, but that seems like a real, the upside of that. So let's say it does work. Let's say Comi the Crescent Moon sits around for 4 turns untouched. Is that good? Is giving everybody else a card and you get one for 4 turns still worth it? I don't know if it is.
You're giving out way more cards than you're getting in return.
Right. And that's the best case scenario. That's that's ignoring the chance that someone Doomblades Comi before your draw step. And
Yeah.
everyone else has gotten a card and you've got none.
This would be fine if there was a Narset Parter of the Veils in the deck,
Or something like that, right?
but there isn't. If Narset was in this deck, I'd feel better about Comi because the chance of them being out at the same time would probably be more often than not.
Yeah, I feel like if you want a draw on a legend, I mean, granted it's 6 mana, but like Arcanus the Omnipotent.
Yeah, it draws you the cards only.
Yeah.
Ooh.
So something like that, there's just, I think, better ways to get that effect than Kami the Crescent Moon, just feels like it's really, really likely to wind up helping other people more than it's going to help you. And this isn't like a group hug deck necessarily either. Sometimes in a group hug deck, the argument is you're helping people. Maybe that will buy you goodwill and they won't kill you or something. I don't think this is the kind of deck where that's the case. I think people aren't going to be looking at things in through a goodwill lens. So that's one I don't love here, but maybe you're in a meta that doesn't work that way too. Who knows? I just don't know. Okay, should we jump over to artifacts next, Max?
Let's do it. There are 17. There's an Arcane Signet, Blackblade Reforged, Bantu's Monument, Commander's Sphere, Dimir Signet, Helm of Kaldra, Helm of the Host, Hero's Podium, Honor-Worn Shaku, Mox Amber, Shield of Kaldra, Soul Ring, Sword of Kaldra, Sword of the Animist, Talisman of Dominance, Umezawa's Jite, and Wayfarer's Bauble. So even in the artifacts, majority of these are legendary as well.
There's a lot of legendary stuff here as well. A couple things we can point out here briefly. The Helm of Kaldra, Shield of Kaldra, and Sword of Kaldra are all equipment, and if you happen to have them all out together, they Voltron up and form a giant creature that is it indestructible? A 4/4 colorless avatar legend named Kaldra into play and attach those equipment to it.
Yep.
So it isn't even indestructible. Although the equipment gives it indestructible, I guess.
So the helm gives the equipped creature first strike, trample, and haste. The shield gives indestructible, and the sword says whenever equipped creature deals damage to a creature, remove that creature from the game, and it gets +5/+5.
So this very much feels like an achievement unlocked kind of thing. I ran all 3 of these in Recce for the first 3 or 4 months. In part, knowing, like, mentally, I thought of that. That was like, well, let's see if I can pull it off. That would be pretty sweet to do. And then I mostly got annoyed that I constantly had one of the cards in hand. And by themselves, they're okay, but not great. So I mostly got annoyed that, like, I never even got close to doing it. And I eventually took all 3 out because it was a situation where, like, it's just so easy to pull all 3 out and free up 3 slots for something else. So that's my situation with them. But I completely, like we talked before, that's a great story when you pull it off.
Oh, for sure. I definitely agree. I think they're cool. It's an achievement unlock thing. I don't know if I would run them personally in my decks or even in this deck, that being said.
Well, and here's the thing. So those achievement unlock kind of effects, or like, hey, this would make for a great story kind of things, you can have too many of those in a deck, and then you wind up becoming more frustrated because you're cutting into the deck's performance. So you have to strike that balance. And in this case, Rona running legendary creatures is probably not something that's super strong to begin with. So you're already kind of building in a speed bump in how fast the deck can go and how strong it's going to be. And devoting too many slots to goofy fun things too this is a deck that could afford this less than, say, like an Edric's by Master of Tress deck, where it's just so good that, or something new, Chulane or Corvault or something, where like the commander's so good and the deck's so good, you can run a bunch of goofy pieces for the fun of it and probably not even notice that much because the deck is so strong. So I would just say finding that balance might be kind of tricky here. And if I was going to pull stuff that's super fun, I would be tempted to pull these ones, but I also understand waiting until you can at least do it one time. Honor-Worn Shaku, I will quick point out because it's kind of a bad card except for in a deck like this. It's a 3-mana colorless mana rock, but you may tap and untap a legendary permanent you control and untap Honor-Worn Shaku. So you have a creature that's clearly not going to be a blocker, or things like the Helm of Kaldra, because it just says permanent. So tap that legendary equipment to untap it and get even more mana. So in this deck, this is the kind of card that's a 3-mana rock that basically, oftentimes is going to read tap for 4 colorless mana. So not a particularly good card, but it's quite good in this type of deck. A couple other ones, Sword of the Animist and Umezawa's Jit. Umezawa's Jit is obviously good. Sword of the Animist, you don't have many other options for ramp, so it's ramp and it lets you recur as well. Blackblade Reforged just kills people.
Oh, for sure.
So great one there. And Bantu's Monument, legendary artifact, so it is legendary as well. Black creature spells cost 1 less. And whenever you cast a creature spell, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. That's one I'm wondering if it's... Do you think it's good enough? There is 33 creatures here, and you're probably going to be casting a lot of them, but I also feel like... And there's a lot of black creatures, too. I don't know.
I think it's better than the blue one.
Yeah, that's probably true.
But that being said, while we're talking about monuments, there's nothing stopping him from running, say, the green one. The
Right.
Ronus' monument that whenever you cast a creature spell, gives another creature +2/+2 and trample. Another way to get trampled through, get some damage through on your creatures for beatdown. So I would actually consider running the green one as well.
Especially because in these colors, the ways to give stuff trample is pretty limited.
Right.
And if you're relying on the combat damage step, being able to have something that gives you trample, and it's also legendary, so you can recur it and recast it with Rona, is pretty useful. Yeah, I can see that for sure. Hero's Podium, strong card here, gives all your stuff trample and buffs it all up, and again, it's legendary. Mox Amber, kind of a perfect deck for it. Everything else makes sense in here for me.
Yep. One other suggestion I had would be Endless Atlas. Like we've kind of said, there's not a lot of draw in the deck baked in. You don't have your Night's Whispers, your Sign and Bloods, like maybe you and I would typically run in a Dimir deck. So adding an Endless Atlas just might be that little bit to push him up ahead that he needs in the late game.
You just put that in your Dromoka deck, correct?
No, I did not. I put something else in Dromoka. I put Toma Legends.
Oh, that's right. Tome Legends, okay. Were you happy with that the other night? Even though that's not one you suggested, did you like how that played out?
I loved it in a deck where my commander attacks a lot. I don't know how often something like Rona is going to be attacking in this deck, or else I would have suggested Tome of Legends as well.
Yeah, that does make sense. The one artifact I was kind of curious about, and again, it's not legendary, so I'm not sure how devoted Tyler is to that theme, but I was kind of surprised not to see Conjurer's Closet, just because it gives you one more Rona ETB trigger each single turn to exile another card from your graveyard to the exile zone that you can then recast with Rona. You know, I guess we should note this, although it's implicit on the card, but you may cast target historic card exiled with Rona, but it doesn't say when, so it's not like one of those effects where like when she exiles something, you have to cast it until she leaves play. As long as Rona exiled it, it's available to you.
Yep.
So I'm a little, I think Conjurer's Closet would just expand how many cards you have exiled there, because there's no reanimation effects in this deck really. So it's not like you're doing anything else with cards that are in your graveyard. So that's one that would be an option here as well, just to get a few more triggers of Rona exiling stuff to give you access to a few more different things.
And not even just Rona. There are quite a few other creatures in this deck that have ETB effects. So like a Gonti or even Gyruda would be cool to blink at the end of turn.
Yeah, why not? Good point. Blink those, they come back in. It's probably going to be tricky to get counters on stuff with Tetsamok, I guess. But when Torgar enters the battlefield, one target player's life total becomes half their starting life total. Torgar's a pretty good target to blink.
And it would be nice having a little backup to Thassa Deep Dwelling, because it does exactly that. But having an extra copy would be nice.
Yeah. Okay, let's jump over to look at the instants now, because there are no sorcery spells in this deck.
There are no sorcery spells, which we can end with.
Okay, so the instance, we've got Cast Down, which is 1 in a black. Destroy target non-legendary creature. Original counterspell. Displace, which is exile up to 2 target creatures you control, then return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control. So probably blinking Rona, and again, similarly, the couple of the creatures we mentioned under creatures that have good ETBs. Displace is a way to trigger that, as is Ghostly Flicker, as is Illusionist Stratagem. So we have a couple different ways to flicker or blink things to get ETB triggers. There's also a negate, so there's 2 counterspells here, counterspell and negate, and there's Farika's Libation, where you choose one, target opponent sacrifices a creature, or target opponent sacrifices an enchantment. So I guess it's a way to remove enchantments in black, something that's usually a struggle. All right, instant package, Max, any thoughts here?
I applaud him for very few counterspells, 2 counterspells total.
Yeah.
Farika's Libation confuses me a little bit. I get it's one of the few ways to deal with enchantments, but if you cast it at the wrong time, it's your opponent's choice on what they sacrifice.
Yeah.
So if they have a Doubling Season and a Mirari's Wake, which one are they going to get rid of? They're not going to get rid of both.
Yes.
So, I mean, this isn't what I would run, but again, I don't play a lot of Dimir, but knowing this is kind of like a legendary tribal, I would want to put more either card draw in here or just more protection, since I don't have a lot of duplicates that do kind of the same thing.
Well, talk about card draw, and I guess there's one I will suggest over under sorceries that I might run in place of this that is a card draw spell. But yeah, this is one I didn't necessarily love. So since he's running Counterspell that does cost double blue, one that you might consider here in that slot is Disallow, since it costs double blue as well, but it's one more. Just because it does have the Stifle effect on it, and you can stop someone from hitting your graveyard. So if you're in that position, it's not ideal. You are paying a little bit more, but like I don't know if Stifle is worth running just for that effect. I would bet it isn't in this deck, but I feel like it's maybe worth running the Disallow to protect your own graveyard, in addition to other weird stuff might happen, stopping that Aetherflux Reservoir trigger or something. So it does have a lot of utility, but I think if you are in a graveyard deck, it's one I would maybe consider just because it's one of the few ways you can stop that Scavenger Grounds or Bojuka Bog when they're aimed your direction.
Fair enough.
That's really all I had over here. I like the blink effects. That makes sense. You're playing blue-black, and if you had room, Pondrify's great, Rapid Hybridization, Reality Shift are all great, but you're running 33 creatures, so you just don't have room. Like if you've committed yourself to a creature deck, you just don't have slots for a lot of that kind of stuff, so I get it.
Yep.
What do we have for enchantments here, Max?
There are 2 enchantments.
That's it.
We have an Argyle's Bloodfast, so that is the flip enchantment from Ixalan. You can pay 1 and a black and 2 life to draw a card. Then at your upkeep, if you have 5 or less life, you may transform it into Argyle's Bloodfest. You may transform it, which becomes the Temple of Axolotls. Sure. It adds black, and you can sacrifice a creature to gain life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness. And then there's also a Merit Lage's Slumber, 1 and a blue, legendary snow enchantment. Whenever Merit Lage's Slumber or another snow permanent enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more snow permanents, sacrifice Merit Lage's Slumber. If you do, create Merit Lage, a legendary 2020 black avatar creature token with flying and indestructible. I mean, there are 23 snowlands in the deck, plus this, So I like it.
I like Merit Lage's Slumber here as well. Makes sense with the snowlands for sure. Argyle's Bloodfast, I'm a little less sold on. I guess it's a draw effect, and it flips into a land that you're probably not going to use that much because you're never going to be, how often do you have 5 life? That's a tough thing to sit at in Commander for a long period of time or to count on. It's okay.
Yes.
However, looking at speaking of Ixalan lands that transform, Search for His Canta isn't necessarily a draw effect like that, but it lets you do a card quality thing because at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library, you may put it into your graveyard, and then if you have 7 more cards, you may transform Search. Putting cards in your graveyard in this deck where you want them there to exile with Rona seems really, really useful. And being able to flip it, and then it's much easier to flip in this deck, having 7 or more cards in your graveyard, and once you flip it, you can spend 2 and a blue to look at the top 4 cards of your library and reveal a non-creature, non-land, and put it into your hand. That part is trickier because half of your deck, more than half of it, about 60% of it, are creatures and lands, so that's a little less useful, but it is top 4 cards, so odds are you're going to get one thing at least of those that's a card to hand. So I feel like the flip side, even though it isn't great in this deck, is still pretty useful. And Search for His Canta, I feel like, is probably more useful than the Argyle's Bloodfast in this deck. So I feel like that's a change I would make. I know Search isn't super cheap. This is 35 cents, and Search is probably sitting around 10, at least it was last time I checked. Correction, Search is now 16. So,
Ooh.
Hey, I was wrong on one, and I was too high on one and too low on this one.
Too low on the other.
Split the difference. But I'm tempted to go that road instead of Bloodfast. But any other thoughts on enchantments here?
I mean, I agree. Bloodfast isn't my jam. It's legendary though, so props on the flavor win.
Absolutely.
I think I'd rather just run Phyrexian Arena instead.
Maybe, yeah.
That's just me.
Maybe, sure.
But you know what? I get it. It's legendary. It's on theme. Works for me.
Yes. For sure. Next, we have 4 Planeswalkers. Ashiok Dream Renderer. Ashiok has the static abilities, spells, and abilities your opponents control can't cause their controller to search their library, and target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, then exile each opponent's graveyard. So you have some graveyard hate, and you can self-mill with this. Seems pretty perfect in this deck.
Yes.
We have original Jace Pellerin, so here's some draw. +2, each player draws a card. -1, target player draws a card, and -10, target player puts the top 20 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Conceivably something you can self-target with if you needed to. Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, is 1 and trip blue with a static. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game. That seems like a tricky clause to hit in this deck. Target player puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard and draw a card. So hitting yourself with this to self-mill makes sense. And -8, draw 7 cards. If your library has no cards in it, you win the game. Again, probably not something you're going to hit, but drawing 7 cards is still pretty decent. Last, Liliana Dreadhorde General for 6. Static ability, whenever a creature you control dies, draw a card. And create a 2/2 black zombie for her +1. Her -4 is each player sacrifices 2 creatures. And a -9, each opponent chooses a permanent they control and sacrifices the rest. Excuse me, so chooses a permanent of each permanent type they control and sacrifices the rest. I like Ashiok. Jace Pellerin is fine. I don't necessarily love it just as a draw engine, but I guess 3 mana, and it is legendary, so it's recurable. Wielder of Mysteries, the +1 is pretty decent because you get some mill, which you want, and you draw a card. That's worthwhile. And Liliana Dreadhorde General, again, doesn't have a ton of synergy here, but it's just a good card, and you are playing 33 creatures, so when a creature you control dies, draw a card, probably triggers fairly often. What do you think?
So I really don't like Jace Pellerin. I always use Jace Pellerin for the -1 target player. I'm not a big fan of giving everybody cards.
Yeah.
My personal opinion, I'd swap this for Jace Unraveler Secrets, which is 5 mana, but his +1 lets you scry and draw. His -2 returns a creature to its owner's hand, and his ultimate says counter each first spell of each opponent casts, essentially. A little more mana to cast, but a bigger loyalty counter, so he doesn't die as quickly, in my opinion.
And you're not giving everybody else a bunch of cards, too.
Right.
And there's also Jace the Living Guild Pact, who, again, doesn't draw you cards, but look at the top 2 cards and put one of them into your graveyard. Again, fuels that graveyard synergy thing you have as well. And if you happen to have something else in your graveyard that you need to get back, there's some synergy on this -3 too to return another target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So it gives you a bounce effect, which hits any permanent, be it a troublesome enchantment or artifact, whatever, things you can't normally deal with in your colors. At least it gives you a bounce effect. So Living Guild Pack, while probably the least liked to Jace, isn't bad in this deck either.
I'm not a big fan of Liliana in this deck either. It's a powerhouse card.
Yeah.
He is running 33 creatures, so I bet you do draw quite a bit off her.
6 is a lot.
6 is a lot. The -4, losing 2 of your own creatures, which none of them are fairly cheap. It's not like your second tokens. Yeah. But I think it's just there for the draw. I guess that's cool as well. I mentioned earlier, Narset Parter of the Veils would be great in here. It's going to slow your opponents up. Her minus ability is essentially what Search for His Canta does.
Right.
So you still get that effect to kind of dig down through your deck. But out of all of them, I don't like Jace Pellerin the most, I think.
Yeah, I could kind of agree with that. The efficiency helps, only being 3 mana, but I don't love him necessarily either. Okay, you wanted to touch on sorceries here real briefly, Max. What do you want to say here?
So there are no sorceries in this deck, which, that's cool.
Yeah.
If I were to modify this, I think I'd add a couple. I would add add a board wipe or 2. Add some draw. Chart a Course lets you draw 2 cards, and if you're attacking a lot in this deck, then you don't have to discard. There's sorceries is where all the black card draw kind of comes in, and I think that's what this deck just really needs, is a little more card draw.
The one, speaking of black draw, the one I thought of, and I'm kind of hinted at it before, I love Notion Rain just in general, but this is a perfect deck for it. It's basically a Read the Bones with Surveil instead of Scry, but in this kind of deck, Surveil's probably better than Scry. The option to put something in your graveyard is really, really useful in a deck that cares about stuff going into the graveyard. So I think Notion Rain's just a great card, and if I was adding something to a sorcery slot, this is a perfect deck for that card. That's it for me. I'm out of options, Max.
Same here.
So we'll wrap this up here. First of all, I said it before, but I'm just really, really thrilled. Number 1, to see a Rona deck. Number 2, to see a really creative implementation of a Rona deck. So thank you very much for sharing both those things, because it was really fun to look at.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. This is a cool, unique build that, you don't see a lot, especially on a commander you don't ever see, to be honest.
Yeah, not at all. Looking at EDHREC, there's 175 Rona decks. That's next to nothing. That's less than 1% of the Dimir decks out there. So it's very, very underplayed, or at least low played as far as commanders go. But that's a super cool way to use it. So Tyler, thanks a lot for supporting us, and thanks a lot for sharing this deck with us.
Yes, thank you, Tyler.
We'll be back on Monday with another show. I am Dana, and you can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited to the nines by Rafael Garcia, who does a fantastic job and can be found on Twitter at Ursa Bearwalker, and our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin MacLeod, licensed via Creative Commons. We will be back next week in your ear holes with another show. Until then, I am Dana.
And I'm Max.